Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Lavinka, and I'm the event director at the bookstore, and I'm so pleased today to welcome Padma Viswanathan here to discuss her translation of Graciliano Ramos's masterpiece, São Bernardo, in conversation with NYRB Classics editor Edwin Frank. We're especially happy to be continuing our series with our friends at the NYRB Classics, and that we're able to reach so many of you in the comforts of your home. So to the housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click the Q&A button just here at the bottom of your screen and submit your question that way. We'll try to get through as many as we can at the end of the event. There's also the chat here below where I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book, as well as a link to donate to organizations fighting racism and police brutality, if that is within your means. The caveat that I have already gone through, we are at the mercy of our home internet connections, but hopefully that is all resolved and we are on our way. And finally, we're adding more virtual programming every week. Next Tuesday, we're thrilled to welcome Donald Nicholson-Smith here to discuss his translation of Serge Pay's Treasures of the Spanish Civil War with Caleb Crane. And next Thursday, June 25th, we're excited to have Otessa Moshfegh here for the launch of her new novel, Death in Her Hands, with our partners at Murmur. These events are free, and you can register for them on our website, where you can also consider joining our newsletter to stay up to date on virtual programming through the summer and fall. So about our presenters tonight, and I'll get out of the way. Padma's debut novel, The Toss of a Lemon, has been published in 8 countries and was a finalist for several prizes. Her second novel, The Ever After of Ashwin Rao, was a national bestseller in Canada and was shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize. Her short fiction and nonfiction work has been published in several outlets, including Granta, the Boston Review, Elle Canada, and Guernica. She teaches creative writing at the University of Arkansas. And Edwin was born in Boulder, Colorado, and educated at Harvard University and Columbia University. He is the author of Snake Train and the editorial director of the NYRB Classics series. Padma and Edwin, the stage is again yours.
All right, thank you, Hal, and good to see you, Padma. Let's see, I had just started to sort of sketch the book and was getting to Paulo Honório rapidly cementing his control over São Bernardo, the ranch which he had worked on as a young man and which his great aspiration is to take possession of, which he will do basically by hook and by crook, and also murder if necessary, as is very quickly made clear at the beginning of the book. And once he gets the ranch, he actually proceeds to improve it in all sorts of ways. He does have a kind of vision of the ranch, which contrasts very much with the previous owner's sense of the ranch, which the previous owners really didn't do anything to it except enjoy whatever money the people who toiled there provided for them. But Paulo Honório puts in a dam and a mill and is in some ways an ambitious to bring about a new world. And the other thing he feels he has to do is get married and have an heir. And so he sets about doing that, and he marries pretty much right in the middle of the book. It's a short book, as I said to people, almost a novella, really, Madalena. And so there the story takes a turn. And it's a story that Paulo Honório himself is telling. And he's not naturally exactly a writer, though he's been written by Ramos in such a way that he is, in some sense, well, he is the brilliant spokesperson. He is a brilliant writer in a way. But I thought I'd turn it over to you now, and if you could read us some of it, perhaps, and then we can talk about the fine points of the book a little bit more, and Ramos and so on.
That would be a total pleasure, yeah. So thank you, everybody out there, for your patience, and for Hal and Community Bookstore for hosting. I didn't get a chance to, I basically blanked on including acknowledgements in the book. And so I've asked Edwin's permission to just open first with a couple of other thanks, first of all, to Edwin for having such faith in this project since the beginning, which meant the world to me as a novice, relatively a novice translator, making such detailed notes, encouraging me to make the text sound the way I heard it, I think, which is maybe something we'll get a chance to talk about. Sarah Kramer with NYRB, who also made excellent notes. Sheila Ribeiro, who was my first Portuguese teacher and was an excellent consultant early in the project, especially on something that Edwin will want to talk about, the expressions of the Northeast, the particular vernacular there. Sarah Wells, who's a scholar and translator who read this twice for me, and my husband, Jeff Brock, who's my translation mentor, and was the one who pushed me very early on to get started on this. So those are just a few acknowledgements. I think every translation is a group project. Already you're collaborating with the writer, right? And then with all the people who birth it. So I would love to read a little. I'm just going to go ahead and read the first 2 chapters. They're very short, so it'll be well under 10 minutes, but I'm going to open with a little of the Portuguese. It's a corrected edition. I had the very good fortune to work with this from Editora Record, this corrected late 2012 edition, and then I'll read, of course, from NYRB's gorgeous edition. I love the cover, so that's also been a
it's a beautiful cover.
Francisco Rebolo, for anybody who wants to know, a northeastern Brazilian painter whose daughter gave us permission to use it. So I'll just read the opening of it in Portuguese. Antes de iniciar este livro, imaginei construí-lo pela divisão do trabalho. Dirigi-me a alguns amigos e quase todos consentiram de boa vontade em contribuir para o desenvolvimento das letras nacionais. Padre Silvestre ficaria com a parte moral e as citações latinas. João Nogueira aceitou a pontuação, a ortografia e a sintaxe. Prometi ao Arquimedes a composição tipográfica. Para a composição literária, convidei Lúcio Gomes de Azevedo Gondim, redator e diretor do Cruzeiro. Eu traçaria o plano, introduziria na história rudimentos de agricultura e pecuária, faria as despesas e poria o meu nome na capa. So I'll start again in English, and just keep in mind this is a grizzly, old-ish, same age as me, 50-ish, grizzly old, big, burly Brazilian. Before I started this book, I thought division of labor was the way to go. I approached several friends, and most of them heartily agreed to pitch in for the betterment of our national literature. Padre Silvestre would look after the moral side and the Latin quotations. João Nogueira took on punctuation, spelling, and syntax. I promised Arquimedes the typography, while for literary flair, I invited Lúcio Gomes de Azevedo Gondim, editor and director of the Cruzeiro. I'd outline the plan, insert the basics of agriculture and cattle raising, cover the costs, and put my name on the cover. It was an exciting week, meeting with my main collaborators. I could already see the volumes on display. 1,000 sold thanks to the eulogies I'd placed in the wafer-thin Gazeta on Costa Brito's recent death, trying to gain some advantage. Anyway, my optimism went up in smoke when I realized we weren't all seeing eye to eye. João Nogueira wanted a novel in the language of Camões, with sentences turned back to front. Count me out. Padre Silvestre gave me a chilly reception. After the October Revolution, he turned fanatical, demanding rigorous investigations and punishments for anyone who wouldn't wear a red scarf. He gave me the side eye. And we were friends. Those patriots, it's fine, everyone has their obsessions. I dropped him from the plan and set my hopes on Lúcio Gomes de Azevedo Gondim, a good-natured journalist who writes what he's told to. We worked for a few days. Afternoons, Azevedo Gondim would leave the newspaper to Arquimedes, lock the nickel and dime drawer, and pedal his bicycle out to São Bernardo, half an hour on the roadway that Casimiro Lopes had been trying to fix with a couple of other guys. He'd comment on the day's headlines, denounce the government, drink the glass of brandy Maria das Dores brought him, and feeling important, meekly command, "Let's get to it." We'd go to the porch, sink into wicker chairs, and work out the plot smoking, looking out on the karaku heifers grazing in the pasture below, and farther out at the edge of the woods, the red roof of the sawmill. At the start, everything went well. We were in perfect agreement, had long conversations. But each of us turned out to be listening to himself, not taking seriously what the other said. Warming to my subject, I forgot what Gonjing was actually like. I saw him as some kind of blank page receiving the confused ideas boiling up in my brain. The result was a disaster. 2 weeks or so after our first meeting, the Cruzeiro's editor presented me with 2 typed chapters of nonsense. I lost my temper. Go to hell, Gonjing. You've made a mess of the whole thing. It's pompous, it's fake, it's idiotic. No one talks this way. Azevedo Gonjing switched off his smile, swallowed the insult, swept together the shards of his meager vanity. Sulking, he objected that an artist can't write the way he talks. He can't? I asked, astonished. Why not? He can't because he can't, Azevedo Gonjing replied. It's like this because it's always been that way. Literature is literature, São Paulo. Folks argue or fight, go about their business in a natural sort of way, but arranging words colorfully is something else. If I wrote the way I talk, no one would read me. I got up and leaned on the balustrade to get a closer look at the limousine bull Marciano was leading into the cowshed. A cicada started buzzing. Old Macarita was coming along the wall of the dam, bent double. In the church tower, an owl hooted. I shuddered, thinking of Madalena, and filled my pipe. It's the devil's own job, Gonjing. It's all gone to pot. 3 failed attempts in a month. Drink your brandy, Gonjing. I abandoned the project until one day I heard another owl hoot. All of a sudden, I started writing, relying on my own resources and not worrying about whether it would benefit me, directly or indirectly. Ultimately, it was just as well that Padre Silvestre, João Nogueira, and Gonjing didn't cooperate. There are matters I wouldn't reveal face-to-face to anyone. I'll describe them here because this book will come out under a pen name. Of course, if anyone knew I wrote it, they'd call me a liar. Let's continue. I mean to tell my story. It's tough. I might neglect to mention useful details, one that seemed to me beside the point, irrelevant. Or maybe, more used to dealing with hicks, I won't trust readers to understand and will repeat insignificant passages. All the rest of it will be arranged without any order, as you'll see. It doesn't make any difference. As my mestizos would say, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Maybe we'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Ramos himself came to writing in a kind of surprising way, and so could maybe tell us a little bit about the author.
Sure, there's a lot of fun stories attached to his origins. So he was born in the late 19th century in quite a remote part of Brazil, a small town in the state of Alagoas, in the Northeast, which is a region subject to periodic droughts and is geographically, Brazil's a huge country, so very isolated from what were then and what more or less remain the cultural centers of Brazil. In about 1914, 1915, he went south to Rio to try to make it as a journalist. He was just starting to get a foothold when he was informed that 4 of his family members had succumbed to the bubonic plague that was then ravaging his hometown, Palmeira dos Índios. I just learned this recently. I'd always heard that he just sort of failed. He was timid, he was provincial. It was very difficult for him. He writes about this in his letters, but researching, he eventually would translate Camus' The Plague, and in kind of investigating that story, I found out that actually his father gave him the option, come home or don't come home, but 3 of his siblings and a nephew had succumbed. His mother was sick then, and another sister, I think, and he just took a boat home, married his childhood sweetheart, set up shop, as his father was also a shopkeeper. And then in 1928, so he was largely self-educated too, didn't do post-secondary education, just read in between customers, and set up a little school in his town. A number of his students actually went on to considerable success, even though he himself didn't have a formal education. And he was eventually strong-armed into becoming mayor of his town. So there he is, it was 1928, he didn't want to do this. It was actually a number of dominant families in the area who forced him to take this on. And then once he took it on, he decided his big mission was both cleanup, anti-corruption, and litter, cleaning the streets. And we know this in part because he wrote about it in his annual reports. Both in 1929 and 1930, he sent annual reports to the governor of the central government, right, the state of Alagoas in the capital. And the reports were hilarious. They're witty. They paint this picture of provincial life and all the people who think he's going to get shot, as his predecessor did get shot, and that was why there was a vacancy. All kinds of just sarcastic and really vivid. And so somebody got this out to the press, and eventually this poet and publisher, Augusto Frederico Schmidt, contacted him and said, I don't suppose you're writing anything else? And he said, well, yeah, actually I have this novel. He pulled out complete, and that was his first book, Caetes, that was published in, I think, 33. So yeah, origin stories of,
When you've translated one of those reports, I think, and was published in the great Canadian little magazine Brick, and it is, he ends by saying that if there was a vote held today, I would get maybe 4 votes after going through, and he then went on to write 5 novels or 4?
4 novels.
4 novels. Yeah, I mean, the first one he wasn't terribly proud of, but the other 3 are all considered major works of Brazilian literature, and in some sense, the works that kind of modernized the Brazilian literature in something of the way that Paulo Honório is saying in that chapter you read of let's actually represent how people actually speak, and let's not cover things with all sorts of florid 19th century writing. But the other thing that's interesting about the books, I have the sense, is that they're each quite different. He also spent some time in prison, right under the Vargas dictatorship. He was imprisoned for a whole year or something like that. Was he not? Yeah.
Yes, he was on a prison island near Rio. It was a weird thing too, because before that, he had been made the director of education, I think, for the state. And then he was, director of public education, I guess. He was dismissed from that post. There were uprisings. Vargas was through the 30s consolidating power. His government was becoming increasingly visibly fascistic. And on suspicion of participating in this communist revolt, he was imprisoned from 36 to 37. He had already been ill the previous year. Throughout his life, he'd have these long bouts of illness. And when he eventually died in early 50s, 53, I think, he was working on a memoir of his incarceration. It was a monumental work, still unfinished and uneven, but he did eventually.
Novels, right?
Beg your pardon?
He pretty much given up writing novels, and he turned to earning his keep by translating, as you said, The Plague, and so the 4 novels are all works of the 30s, and yeah.
Correct. Yeah, they were all. His last one was published in 38, I think, shortly after his release, and he never again wrote fiction. Now, I mean, Infancia, his memoir, Childhood, that he published a few years later, it's also slim, and it's very much in the vein of these books, but less linear, more sort of impressionistic. But these works are, in various ways, that I suppose many novelists do this. They're sort of splintered, refracted views of his biography in various ways anyway. But,
Well, let's talk a little bit about Paulo Honório, whose story the book is. He's an interesting, he's a character who goes out of his way to say, I'm the simplest of men and I only know the things I know. As he says, he's going to put into the book all the stuff about cattle. Right. But the curious thing is he's not a simple man at all. Only he's driven to deny, or it strikes me, he's driven to sort of deny his complexity in a way that is kind of fascinating and creates a perpetual tension in him, a violence within him, really. I mean that, he's also a sort of representative man. But how did you see him in working on the book and translating? Because he's quite kaleidoscopic in certain ways.
Yeah, he is, as you described. He's sort of pitched himself in war with himself in a sense, and over the topic of words largely, right? What will happen to him is, so he was born in obscurity. He doesn't really know who his parents are. He's raised by a couple of people, including this sweet seller, Margarita, who's referred to at the end of that first chapter. He's illiterate. He's working as a farmhand on this farm, São Bernardo, and he gets into a fight over a girl and he gets thrown in jail. And somehow, because he apprentices himself to this guy with a Bible, he learns to read. And so he emerges then from this sort of chalice of imprisonment with the ambition to turn his newfound literacy into a prosperity that previously was denied to him. And so his ambition is to reestablish himself in the place where he's from, Viçosa, but particularly to buy that farm, São Bernardo, for which this his book will be named. And so he's really, in the way that he has reinvented himself, he's reinvented himself as something he kind of despises, right? A class of person that he admired from afar for what they have. He coveted what they had, but he didn't admire who they were. He doesn't admire literacy for its own sake. He doesn't admire it, sort of fancy words and words that elevate you above others and make you obscure. What he likes are manuals on agriculture, as you say, things that make the world clearer. So the book itself is also this sort of combinatory process of those warring impulses. That he is writing this really to understand what happened and also to expiate himself, but at the same time, it's an expression of the things that he dislikes. He wants to make it unpretentious, but just the fact of trying to be truthful and talking about his emotions puts him in this kind of pretentious place, right? So in talking about this, I haven't talked about the book a lot. You ask how I saw him and what my experience was of him. I mean, he's going to do some really terrible things. And I had one wonderful interviewer, Miguel Conde, with Words Without Borders, describe him to me as vicious. He does, as you've said, he kills to, he doesn't admit it. It kind of happens when he's not there, but he kills his neighbor because his neighbor is disputing the borders of his land. And I found myself defending him. I found myself defending him. I couldn't help it because I think I was just so deep inside his torment in a way. And also he's very sweet to Margarita, who raised him. He will never stop punishing himself for what he did to Madalena. I feel his pain.
He grew up, she's a candy maker and sort of just selling street candy, I think, and making it in a little hut and so on.
Yeah.
He's a rebellious figure, but he also is desperate for success and to conform. So he provides a window on Brazilian society, which, I mean, he's incredibly aware of all the abuses that go on. And in some sense, he makes, I think the reader feels some tolerance for him because he works in a fundamentally corrupt and violent world. And I think the town, what is the town that he's in, or the town that the ranch is outside of?
Viçosa. They ironically named Viçosa. It means like lush or green.
It's actually, is it really actually very dry in that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, I don't know that, I have never been in Viçosa itself, but Alagoas, as with the whole sort of backlands of the Northeast, is subject to these searing periodic droughts. The Vida Seca is the final book, which that literally translates as dry lives. In that book, you see these droughts that bankrupt people, that force farmhands out on the road to try to make their living elsewhere and in other circumstances. So yeah, I mean, it's the most salient aspect of that region are those droughts. Yeah.
There's also just endemic violence, I think, in these towns too, right? And at least at the time that. I think you were saying before that when Ramos was the mayor, his predecessor had been shot, and it wasn't unlikely that he might himself meet a similar end. And so this is the context which Paulo Honório is also operating. he doesn't, and he sort of proudly, I mean, this is a book about a man, but also a man, complicated man, his view of women. And in this fairly lean and short book, you don't really see, I mean, he's sort of boastful all the time about what a big success he is at the beginning and how everybody else is such a crook, but he's gotten the better of them. And you're sort of surprised when suddenly his thoughts turn to women, and I think he's sort of surprised. Women confound him utterly, it seems.
Yeah, he says he doesn't, women are just he confesses this right in the moment when he says, okay, I'm going to dedicate a whole chapter to Madalena. Madalena is the woman he ends up marrying. But he has in mind, I mean, this is a guy who, at various points will talk about dating and courtship rituals in terms of what his manuals on breeding have told him. So he has in mind a sort of a big hipped gal who's going to produce a lot of, healthy farm kids who are going to run around and, carry his reputation robustly into the future. And instead, he, when he goes to court such a woman, he finds in the sitting room with her Madalena, who is this slight, blonde, circumspect, smart reader, and he falls for her. And it's against his own nature to do this. She's a writer also. She writes for the newspaper that Azevedo Gonjin edits. This is going to become a very serious bone of contention between them. And so this is perhaps the first moment when, up until now, he has hidden a number of things. He's not very well, but he's hidden a number of things from the reader, the kinds of criminal activities he's done in order to acquire the ranch, for example. But now something has happened that is hidden from him, his own emotions, his own reactions, why she's the one for him. And so he's forced to sort of lay it out as well as he can, but he's pursuing the mystery of his own attraction as the book proceeds.
Equally is also mysterious is her attraction to him. Tell us a little bit about Madalena. Especially, I mean, you could tell us about his proposal is nothing if not blunt.
Right. Yes. And he says, and I like you. And she knew this was coming. She had sort of half wished it wasn't. She lives with her aunt. Her aunt raised her in very difficult circumstances. Madalena is a school teacher. School teachers' salaries are very poor, and he's offering her what he claims is this, prosperous, wholesome life out in the country on this farm. That he really, the most poetic parts of the book are when Paulo Honório is describing his property. We heard about the red roofs, the sawmill, the pau d'arco trees, the sort of yellow shades, and he'll describe the clouds. The hills, the shadows of the clouds passing over the hills and the surrounding areas. It's the closest he comes to poetry is when he feels his, what he's accomplished. And so he advertises this to the aunt and to Madalena, and Madalena says, well, I have to confess, I don't love you. And he's like, modern notions of love. I mean, what's love? People need to get together, babies need to be born. And she sort of allows herself to be won over by this and by this adventure of, what is this, the country? I mean, she has that kind of a spirit. But as soon as she gets there, that same curiosity and adventuring spirit gets her into some trouble with him, because he's also ambitious and has an active mind and wants things to do and wants to fix things, improve things. So.
Yeah, the two really don't understand each other. When you read the opening chapters, you introduce the cast of characters who come out throughout the book. And so is Padilla also one of the people? Clearly, Padilla probably is not one of the people he lists to help him write the book, because he has utter contempt for Padilla, who is the son of the previous owner, who is just, what does he call him at some point, a bed bug? Something.
So inconsequential.
But he has brought Padilla on to teach at the local school, right? I mean, I think simply in order to get government funding for the school or to curry favor with the government or something like that. Because of course, the notion of educating the people on his ranch is, he thinks is contemptible beyond words. Anyway, but all the other characters you mentioned, Gondim and so on, are all regulars at the ranch and come and visit them. And they all actually, they all kind of love Madalena.
Yeah, well, he had actually already heard about her from them, right? He came
That's
upon
right.
them all
That's right.
discussing her looks, really, but also
Yeah.
discussing how smart she is, but also her legs, you know, I mentioned her legs, right? So yeah, her reputation preceded her with them. And yes, when she arrives, she's a fresh presence, and she listens to people, but she especially listens to all of the workers much more than Sao Paulo wishes he would. She wants to look after them. She wants to get them medicines. She wants to advocate for their rights. And this starts to lead to very serious conflicts between them, especially when he hears Padilha, the previous dissipated owner of the ranch. You know, all he did was lie around there and drink and, you know, once in a while host a party. He's spouting communism, right? So this is where the sort of broader context starts to invade the ranch in ways that make Sao Paulo feel threatened. That, you know,
Yeah.
he's basically advocating for, at least within the borders of São Bernardo, a very clear feudal system.
Yeah.
And he does not want, notions of equality to sort of penetrate via Madalena and the others who are there.
Well, and in that sense, that opening sentence, which I think is quite famous in Brazil, to begin with, I thought I'd start with division of labor. In effect, associates Paulo Honório with a certain model of kind of capitalist development, whereas in an oversimplified or reductive allegorical reading, which you could give the book, but which is nonetheless partly true, Madalena is a reforming figure, and a figure who actually wants some kind of social provision made for these people. But it is a certain parable of Brazilian politics, which frankly to this day would seem to be from what's going on in Brazil right now.
Right, yeah. In various ways it is. I mean, it's Graciliano Ramos's gift that he, of course, resists easy readings but admits multiple readings, and so you can certainly gloss it that way if you take each of them as these figures. But of course, São Paulo himself sort of fights both sides of that. Because he's a nouveau riche, he comes from this oppressed class, right? And late in the book, when disaster has ultimately struck, and he's been sort of his fate has taken revenge on him for his ambition in some ways. Mm-hmm. He fantasizes about what his life might have been had he not tried to overreach, in a sense. And it's not true. It's not true at all. His own nature and the changing circumstances of Brazil presented this opportunity and the means to take advantage of it. And yet there is in him this sort of backward-looking nostalgia, right, that also sort of pervades the book in a way.
Yeah, I mean, so here's this man whose whole career is premised on destructive exploitation of other people and of the landscape, and yet, as you say, he's and destructive exploitation finally of himself. And there's a moment there's several times in the book where he reverts to describing himself, his physique and his body, and initially with a good deal of pride. He'll talk about, I'm huge and I'm whiskery and so on. But there's a moment late in the book where suddenly he looks in the mirror of his book and is absolutely devastated by what he sees. It's as if he sees an utter stranger, but he sees no way in which he can actually put his life back together. It's one of the, in corresponding before, we were saying there is a Dostoevskian element that suddenly comes into the book of the man who has sort of blown himself up in a curious way.
Yeah, there's some people who say that Raskolnikov has an internal guilt that he needs to fulfill by committing a crime. And in a sense, Paulo Honório also has this sense, and you see it in those moments when he splits. And I think you might be referring to a bit where he and Madalena had been fighting, and he's looking at her. She's asleep on the bed. She's curled in one corner of the bed, and he's looking at her, doubting her. He hears scratching on the roof. He's sure that it's some lover come to visit her. All of this, whatever envy he has of her capacities with words, whatever ways in which he feels threatened by her reforming instincts, it all funnels into sexual jealousy. Like that, his reflective, or his reflexive nature is to grab sexual jealousy. And so he's sitting there hearing all of this, just working himself up into this paranoid rage. And he looks at his hands and he looks at himself and he thinks, well, of course she would go with anybody else. How could she love me?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's in this, quite literally in the dark, his long dark night of the soul, that he thinks this, and he can see himself in what he thinks is a kind of a true light, which is devastating to him.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, so it comes to sort of study in both self-assertion and self-contempt, in a kind of vicious circle of it, which is, and then, I mean, I was thinking, because the poetry is threaded in the most delicate sort of way, and I was trying to think, between, as well as he's going along worrying about how to write his book, and so I, for example, was thinking how, he's thinking about talking to Madalena. I tried to recall what we said. Impossible. My words were just words, imperfect reproductions of exterior facts, and hers had something about them I can't express. To feel them, I used to switch off the lights, letting shadows envelop us until we were two indistinct figures in the darkness. Outside, the toads declaimed, the wind moaned, the trees in the orchard lost their outlines in the dark. Which is a beautiful image. And of course, it's your image in part because you wrote those English words. So, I mean, tell us about the difficulties of translating this book and the challenge that it presented.
Yeah, I mean, you were there for some of it, right? I revere Graciliano, and working on the book made me admire him, more and more with each successive reading. You had asked me as we were chatting before we got here what relationship this translation has to my own writing, and I realized just in the way that when somebody wanted to call Paulo Honório vicious, I needed to defend him. I did feel in a weird way that I wrote him. I wrote, yes, those English sentences, but I didn't write Graciliano. I'm not the writer of the book. I wrote what you have in your hands, but I read Graciliano, and I think that I had never kind of fully physically tried to articulate that weird position that I felt I'd been in relative to the book and relative to its original author. It takes many, many registers, this book. In parts, it's very funny. People often talk about the humor of it. There are those parts where when I felt like I needed to communicate in the words his sense that the meaning is only there once they dissolve, right? Mm-hmm. That's what is happening in that passage that you read. It's those sounds and the feeling of Madalena beside him, and the fact that her words really belong to her. All of that feels concrete to him. His words don't feel concrete to him. So when those things are allowed to dissolve, then you have the feeling, as he does, that there's a unity, that those two halves that we've been talking about come together in some sense, that he really, like the material improvements he's made on the farm, the fact of what he can see and smell and experience of the improvements there, those are all real. And when the words fall away, then you have a sense of it. So all of that, it was part of my experience of translating it on the sort of day-to-day level, to try to communicate the humorous rhythms were, that was something I tried to tweak to get over my own reverence. I think was one of the things that you coached me at the end, that I just that was a sort of another level to really make it try to sound the way it sounded in my mind, as opposed to some version of a precious way that maybe I thought it might sound at a slight distance from me. So that ownership was a challenge. Also the expressions. The book is packed with these obscure, presumably Northeastern expressions. I mean, Graciliano talks in one of his letters to his wife, his second wife, Eloisa, about having written the book in Portuguese and now translating it into Brazilian, but a Brazilian that he didn't even know existed before he started really digging into it. So I found at a certain point a glossary of the a number of the words and expressions in this book that dedicated exclusively to this book. And many of the expressions are not found in any other print source except in this book. So it was, customers who came into the store or guys who worked on his father's farm, and he would be interviewing them, I guess, about expressions, and he packed them all in. And so I had to learn then a number of them that seem obscure to us, like it's time for the jaguar to drink water. That means when like push comes to shove, or the moment of truth. And that's quite a common expression that I had not known at all. Every monkey on his own branch. That one I did know because it's the chorus of a very well-known song by Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil. So I was lucky with that one that I knew. Plus, every monkey on his own branch, it's pretty obvious what that means. It means, it's none of your bags, right? Every monkey on his own branch. So there were some of them like that I could translate directly. Some of them like, it's time for the jaguar to drink water. I couldn't, but I tried to numerically figure out like how many were completely obscure, how many were pretty well known, and tried to recreate a similar sort of, and how many of the ones that were really uncommon, how many you could figure out in context or not. And so because what I realized when I was consulting with my friend Sheila, my first Portuguese teacher, whose mother is from the Northeast, and I consulted with her mom also and with other people in the Northeast, there are a number of these expressions that just nobody knows. Like nobody knows them. Like that is to say, nobody who is audience, middle-class Brazilian readers, whether they're in the Northeast or in the South. So they themselves would be befuddled by a number of these expressions. And I felt like I had to leave a number of them in those befuddling terms, even though I risked then alienating, English readers who might think like, what, does she not know how to translate? Which maybe I don't, but the idea is that in this way, Graciliano had very slyly blocked access to the class of readers, the class of people that Paulo Honório is aiming to join, that class of people that he knows will never accept them. Well, they can't totally understand this book either, okay? This is where it stops. And so I felt like I had to create that barrier there in the language too, but I could do it with the actual expression. So some of them I translated literally, and they're just like, I have no idea really what he's saying.
No, they paint, the ones you just mentioned also paint, of course, a landscape and a way of living, and then, I mean, this is such a thoroughly and carefully or inspiredly written book in a way that that's also part of the peculiar poetry, as well as the abrasive poetry of the book too. But I think we should perhaps turn and take some questions at this point. Yeah.
Great, I'm back. I am much less stressed out than I was last week. I have procured a beer. So we do have some questions. We actually had a question emailed in, so I'm going to read that one first. So Padma, as a novelist yourself, how did your own creative practice impact your approach to such a dense, complicated translation? And on the other end of that question, were there any stylistic devices that you encountered that you think you might be stealing?
I mean, the huge difference, of course, between translating and writing my own book is that the basic ground, the circumstances were all predetermined, right? So in a way, it felt more like revision than it did like writing, just in terms of the sort of process. My process of writing a book is usually I write drafts and then they get refined and added onto over time. And so it was really like, probably most akin to revision in terms of my own process. I did realize that in terms of what I brought, I guess my last novel, The Ever After of Edwin Frank, also centers on quite an unsympathetic narrator, a prickly middle-aged guy who has some trouble with women. And so I just didn't even really recognize that until this was over. So maybe I brought some fundamental sympathy to him that way also. As to what I might steal, I mean, on a technical level, I think it has to do with the daring of the book, just the incredible chances and confidence that he has to switch between registers from the depths of this poetry representing the concrete, representing the natural world, to this really abrasive humor. I find that very inspiring, and I would like to believe that I would try to aspire to see the world that way also, as containing all of that. But more than anything, it was just just really a privilege to work on it, you know, and a very humbling thing to do, especially to work on a dead author. In my cosmology, I don't think he knows that I did this, and that I really wanted to bring this book to English readers. I just really believe that more people should read it, and it felt very now it just becomes more about me again, because all writers are narcissists, but like very spiritually fulfilling to have done that, to have brought his book to more readers.
Our next question, Brazilian literature is very quirky, as are films from that country. How do you account for this quality? Isolation? Unusual cultural mix?
I guess I would need to know which specific films are being referred to, or specific books. I mean, it's true that, say, like Machado de Assis reads as very quirky for us. He's a Brazilian Lawrence Stern, that's how he's often referred to, and with very good reason. But I wouldn't, for example, describe Jorge Amado or Clarice Lispector, who are equally popular and well known outside of Brazil, as necessarily quirky. Nor would I describe. I mean, Brazil is linguistically isolated, obviously, in the Americas, but culturally, through both the modernist period and in the 60s, the culture demonstrates enormous quivering antennae on the world, right? That really those key cultural moments in Brazilian invention incorporate everything. It's not about isolation at all, I wouldn't say. So where does the quirkiness come from? Again, it might have to do with a sort of a confidence in reading the world from that point of view of linguistic isolation. I mean, I'm thinking right now of, say, the Tropicalismo movement, right? And a number of the sort of lyrics and the poetry that came out of that time that has this very acute, humorous look on what's going on in the rest of the world. But it's a huge country, right? It's a massive country, and coming from, I happen to come from two other massive countries, both Canada and India, and so then anything you look at that comes out of Brazil, you need to also read it in a regional lens, right? And so any region within Brazil could be seen as an isolated sort of cultural atmosphere as well, an environment for incubation as much as the country itself. I don't know if that helps the question.
There we go. I am live again. So I'm going to mix two questions next, just to get through both of them. The first one, how is it, and how has he earned this, kind of now more long-standing comparison to Faulkner? And then also, what aspects of him are perhaps also echoed in someone like Juan Rulfo?
Yeah. Okay, so Faulkner, yeah, a lot of people want to compare Graciliano to Faulkner. I happen to have written quite a long article about this recently for LitHub. It was published last week. I think the title is something like, how come Brazil's William Faulkner didn't achieve the same fame? And so I talk about a number of quite legitimate points of comparison. For example, that both of these guys were writing about these regions quite isolated from the centers of power and culture and money, that their language reflects these regional concerns, and that they deploy language as vehicles not just for mood but for psychology, right? And that this psychology emerges from the land. I mean, there are very interesting readings to be done of Paulo Honório against Thomas Sutpen, who's another, guy who comes out of nowhere and wants to own land and create a legacy and does ruthless things to get that and is punished with tragedy, right? So they're very clear comparisons, but I thought an equally interesting, if not more interesting question, considering that their prose is nothing
like each other.
Like each other. No, yeah, for all these valuable things to be said, ultimately, like sentence to sentence or book to book, they're doing very different things on the level of, especially of language. I think we might ask, why Graciliano didn't achieve the same level of fame. I mean, I posited that it had something to do with, initially Faulkner was seen more as a regional writer, and then the things he was talking about, race questions and violence, became associated in the international eye with American literature more broadly. So then he was an American writer writing in, in English, an American writer in the American century, whereas Graciliano was at the mercy of translators, because as we've discussed, Portuguese is not sort of a world language in the same way that English is. I mean, it is spoken on, 3 continents, but 4, India too, until 67. But as for Juan Rulfo, I suppose, there's again land and violence, these sort of, we were talking about Pedro Páramo, so like small surrealistic twists on the technical level, I think we could say, and also I guess to some extent inherited, but I don't think, I think of that novel as if akin to anything than akin to the Gothic tradition, and I don't see that in Graciliano in the same way. I don't think that's what he's trying to do again. So that's where, comparisons are very useful, but comparisons also fall apart when you really, I think, get dig deep.
Right. Our next question, just to remind everyone, you can ask a question using the Q&A button here below. We still have a few, but just in case you are still asking. Besides Graciliano Ramos, do you have other bits of Brazilian literature you'd love to translate next? What's on your wish list?
By the way, did Edwin want to jump in at all on that last question, especially? I had the impression.
I think there's a bit of a comparison between Vidas Secas and Pedro Páramo, kind of people who are almost spectral presences on the land. But I mean, going back to the Faulkner thing and what you said, there's an element of Faulkner which verges on Jim Morrison. Sort of organ music and so on. And by contrast, Graciliano's is like prepared piano by John Cage, in terms of its spareness. And so in that sense, I agree totally with you. They're really, they're not at all similar writers, as writers per se.
So other projects. I'm a little, there are other things I'd like to do. I'm hesitant to talk about them right now, to tell the truth, because they're in such baby steps. And there's one that I had been working on, and then I found out somebody else is already doing it, which is fantastic. But I think we'll wait and see what happens.
Next question. In translating the book, did you adhere strictly to the syntactical style of the original? The protagonist comes across in your translation as super laconic, relatively oblivious to transitions, devoid of elaborate sentences, prone to simple but often beautiful metaphors. Also, in terms of the vernacular, were there any passages that just stumped you?
So syntax, no. I think that was something I had to get over. But it's not only written in a different language, but in, almost 100 years ago, now 80 years ago. So it needed to be, updated. I think there's always this dance that you do as a translator of work from a previous era between representing that era in the future and trying to approximate for readers the experience that contemporary readers would have had. And I think I tend more toward the latter in my taste in others' translations, that, you know, as a writer and not an academic, I'm not a literary historian, I want first and foremost for readers to have an enjoyable, immersive experience of the work. And that's what I look for, the idea that works can live in the future, not only the artifacts of the time and place of their creation. And so that was my sort of bellwether, that was my standard. But yeah, as I described, a number of things. I mean, when I read it, of course, as when I read with my own novels, there are lots of bits that are painful to me and that I wish I had just not even more time, just more brain to try to do them better. I mean, I had a lot of fun with the expressions, certainly, but the thing that made me feel insecure sometimes with them is, as I said, a number of them don't exist in written form outside of this book. And so I just had no context to evaluate whether I often had to decipher them from the context, because there was no, even the description in that special glossary, it was done by a couple of academics. I mean, they did me a great service, but sometimes their descriptions, sometimes I didn't totally trust even what they said. It didn't seem to make sense to me in the context of the book. So those are the points when I really felt like I was sort of flying solo. So.
And then I think we'll take this as our last question. How did you come to learn Portuguese, and what brought you to translation?
Yeah, I had a very circuitous route toward Brazil. So I was in my 20s, I was researching my first novel, which takes place in the very small isolated place that my family comes from, in São Bernardo in South India. And São Bernardo has a very interesting set of syncretic practices, sites, deities. And so I was looking a lot into syncretic religions, and in doing that, I was reading about, you know, syncretism elsewhere in Cuba and Brazil particularly interested me, especially northeastern Brazil. So I was investigating that a little bit. And then in and around that time, Luaka Bach started and released a bunch of Brazilian music, and I had just never heard music like popular Brazilian music, samba, and I was completely overtaken by it, and it just totally changed my life. So it was basically Caetano Veloso, but also Gilberto Gil and everybody else sort of associated with the movement that really came to prominence in the 60s. And so that was my motivation. But in and around that time also, I was very involved with Amnesty International in my hometown in Edmonton, Alberta. I was head of the Artist Network, and I was approached by an Argentinian man who had been imprisoned and tortured by the dictatorship, who was the head of Amnesty on the non-artist side. So I was part of the Artist Network, and he was head of regular Amnesty. And he said, I was a playwright at that time, and he said he'd like to see a play written about human rights in his region. And I thought about it. It took me a year or two, and I went back to him and said, okay, I can think about this now. And he said, wow, what great timing, because we've brought a policeman to Edmonton, Alberta, which is the northernmost provincial capital in Canada, in January to learn about community policing. So this Brazilian policeman was coming to Alberta he's from Aracaju, from northeastern Brazil, in the middle of winter in Canada, where the days are literally 6 hours long. And so I made friends with him and got this whole inside view on Brazilian policing and human rights and so on. A play came out of it that it didn't go very far, but it was when I went to Brazil to do research for it that I started to learn Portuguese. Crazy stories, yeah. And so that was when I started reading some Brazilian literature. And it was, I first encountered a story by Adelice Souza. That was my first. She's a Bahian writer. A story I translated called The Blue Women. That was the first thing I ever translated. It's Bahia, the state that I'm most interested in. But then when we moved to Arkansas 14 years ago, there were very few people around here with whom I could speak Portuguese. And my husband, who's a translator, encouraged me to consider doing more translation as a way of continuing to be in conversation with this country that fascinates me so much. So
beautiful. And the product is São Bernardo.
Yeah.
So thank you, both of you, so much for tonight. Padma, I'm so happy we could get you on. Also, a special thank you to our audience for bearing with us. You know, we are just at the mercy of wires and tubes these days, all of us. But you can buy a copy of the book at communitybookstore.net. And then also I did post, the chat will disappear briefly, but I did post a link to the LitHub essay that Padma was referencing. So please click on that and check it out. Otherwise, we have more to come in the coming weeks, more NYRB Classics. One that we did just book that we're very excited about is an event with Diane Johnson. So please look for that. That is going to be very exciting. Edwin, Padma, thank you so much. Everyone, have a great night. Be well.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Hal. Thank you, Padma.
Good night.